Hello and welcome to the search engine journal eSummit. I'm super excited and glad to be the one who can open up the day, so to speak, and to be welcoming you to the event today. And the title sounds a little more technical than you might have expected for an opening keynote, but don't worry, I'll gently introduce the topic. So my name is Martin Splitt. I am a developer advocate in the search relations team at Google. And I'm here to talk a little bit about JavaScript for SEOs, more or less the basics. So today we'll talk about a few things. Very first topic that we will address is why is this entire thing so hard? Why is there such a chasm between developers and SEOs? And what can we do about this? And why do we even have to deal with JavaScript? And why does it even matter? And then once we figured out why we should look into these things and why they matter, we look into how websites actually work. I mean, the high-level concept is probably familiar to everyone. You open your browser, you type in a web address, and then you see a website. But what does actually happen behind this? And what can go wrong when JavaScript is involved? And last but not least, we talk a little bit about how to fix the friction between SEOs and developers and what you can do to get better results and to actually have actionable advice to developers that will make a difference in the end and will also be falling onto open ears or meeting open ears with your developers. Right, so why is this so hard? What's going on here? Why is JavaScript everywhere and why is everyone like freaking out about it? I think there is a bit of a disconnect between SEOs and developers oftentimes. In many teams, it seems to be like, oh, the developers are not listening to what I'm telling them, or the developers are building things that are broken in terms of SEO, and how does this happen? And then there's pushback from developers, so like the SEOs come in with ridiculous things or require us to break otherwise good solutions or require us to make changes that take so long and are so complicated to make now that we just can't prioritize it high enough. And I would like to take a step back and think about what we're trying to achieve. SEOs are trying to build websites that can be found by potential customers and users and show up when these customers and users need what you are offering, the services or the product you're offering. And developers want to build a product that works great, is fast, and actually makes the users happy and actually implements and does the things that it needs to do. And does so correctly without failing and without falling over. That's the goal. And I think these goals are compatible. I think developers build for the users, and if there are no users because no one can find it on the web, they won't be happy about this. They want users to use the application they build. So SEO is important to them, even if they might not fully understand or see it that way. And on the other hand, SEOs want the product to be good. What's the point of ranking high when then in the end no one converts and no money is being made because the product just doesn't work? And so we are building towards a shared goal. We're just looking at it from different perspectives, and we need to figure out how we can converge our journeys and actually make this trip on the same road, so to speak, instead of arriving at the goal from different perspectives and like clashing in the middle of the road. So why would you care about JavaScript as an SEO? Why would you care about, the things that developers deal with and JavaScript to begin with? And how does it matter for SEO to begin with if you're using JavaScript and how you're using JavaScript? Why is this important? Well, first things first, JavaScript has historically been the duct tape of the web, so to speak, right? Whenever we wanted something that the web couldn't do, we could emulate it. We could simulate it with JavaScript. We could build some JavaScript that does what we need to do. Classical examples are lazy loading. Before browsers implemented that, we could use JavaScript to make lazy loading happen. If we wanted offline access, then we could sometimes trick around a little bit. If we wanted web components that allowed us to build more interesting user interface elements that didn't exist in the browser, we could use JavaScript for that, and so on and so forth. There has been many different things that weren't possible without JavaScript. Many of them are now possible without it, but a bunch of stuff is still only possible with JavaScript. It also brings powerful features to web experiences. So for instance, service workers are basically allowing websites to work offline or independent of the network. That's done by using JavaScript. A service worker is a piece of JavaScript that sits between the website and the network and makes decisions. So it behaves like apps because you don't have to be online anymore. The website can work without network or with slow network. But that is powered by JavaScript. Without JavaScript, that wouldn't exist. Progressive web apps wouldn't be progressive web apps without JavaScript. It also allows you to respond to things happening. And the obvious things that come to mind are things like clicks, but also things like what if a network resource isn't available? What if the user changes between dark mode and bright mode on their device and stuff like that? You can respond to this using JavaScript and then change the page, change the layout, change the color schema. If you click on a button, you can do something like load an additional piece of content, like an additional image or an additional product. You can do a bunch of stuff that JavaScript enables us to do, especially when it comes to interactive websites where it's not just showing some information, but users want to interact with it. Like a web shop, for instance, you can do a lot of cool stuff with JavaScript that you can't really do without it. It does matter for you as an SEO though, because even if you're not building a super interactive website, if there is JavaScript involved, it has full access to the page content. So JavaScript can make decisions on what content to show, what content not to show, what content to load in, what content to hide. There's a lot of possibilities in terms of what the content will look like that come from JavaScript. JavaScript could, for instance, detect, oh, this is a Google bot, so I'll just like show or hide a piece of information, which can be cloaking, which can be problematic, right? It can inject things. It can inject a different canonical, it can inject a different title, it can inject a different meta description. It has a lot of power over the website, which is why you definitely want to understand what the JavaScript on the pages you're working with does. It also is a very core part of the web. If we talk about web development, you definitely talk about HTML. You should definitely talk about HTML at least. You will talk about CSS because that's how everything looks like. And JavaScript is the third part of the core web technologies, which has a lot of influence over the way of interacting with the page, as well as how the page looks like and how it works. So it's quite a crucial, critical part of the web. And as with every tool, JavaScript is just another tool. It can hurt your website. It can also benefit your website. A service worker that makes your website work offline is great for users who are on bad connectivity. A website that loads so much JavaScript that it takes minutes of downloading JavaScript over the network until you see anything is not great. So JavaScript isn't inherently good or bad. It is a tool, and the way that it's being used by you and your developers determines how good or bad your page will come out on the end of the user. So it is quite important that you understand what the JavaScript on your page does. Also, developers are building according to requirements. And these requirements are usually like how fast does the page load, on which browsers does it work, how does it work, like if I click on this, that thing happens. But SEO is not necessarily a requirement for them, or they are not aware of this. It's a specialty. I mean, you are an expert in SEO. You know a lot of stuff that developers probably don't know, and developers are experts on their field. They know a lot of stuff that you don't know. So we are both incomplete, and we need each other to complete each other's skill set. So if you know that developers need to be aware of certain things like, oh, there's a no index meta robot that needs to be removed from that page, or hey, there's a software for that we can tackle like this, that's stuff that developers might not even have on their list. They might not be even aware of any of that stuff. So definitely talk to your developers, and it's important that you do because they might not know what to do in terms of SEO when they build websites using JavaScript. So how do websites then actually work? Well, it starts off with a recipe, right? So this is basically an ingredient list. The ingredient list is for a page, for an HTML page. It has a title of some sort. It has a headline. It has an image. It has a few paragraphs of text maybe. But that's not what we actually see. This is the recipe. When you are baking something or when you are buying something from a bakery, you want the actual product. You don't want the recipe. But this is what we are creating. We create the recipe that is then being sent to a browser, and the browser now actually makes the dish. So as the browser is making the dish, it looks at the recipe and it basically creates a document. So if I would be baking, I would probably have some sort of pot or pan or something where I actually bake on. And this in this case is the document. And the document in the browser is not anything weird or abstract. It's basically what we call a tree in development. At the top is the document, and then there's the head, there's the body, and then in the body there's, in this case, there was a headline, an image, and 2 paragraphs, and so on and so forth. Inside the paragraph there might be a link, and it goes down quite deep. So as the recipe arrives at the browser, it fills in this tree by creating each of the bits and pieces, each of these elements. So it creates a headline, it creates an image, it creates a paragraph, it creates that link from the HTML. It then puts them together. So basically this is more or less the assembly part of things, where it looks like, okay, so this is a headline, so it takes all the space here, and then there's below it is an image, and next to the image we have some space still left, so we can put a paragraph in here, and then we have a line break, and then we have the next paragraph, and so on and so forth, so that it all fits on the page. It has to do that again if we resize the window, because then obviously everything changes. So if you are on a phone, if you switch between portrait and landscape, it has to relay out these things. But once it has figured out the layout, it can actually start baking. It can actually start rendering, which is putting the pixels into place so that you can see it on the screen. That's more or less how a website is being displayed. And this is also what Googlebot does when it renders. Crawling gets the recipe, and then rendering bakes the actual cake, or renders the actual website. So JavaScript is very powerful and has multiple points of interaction with the way that the browser renders a page. When the browser hits a JavaScript that has some content in the JavaScript as text, it interrupts the browser parsing HTML and actually runs the JavaScript first. Because the JavaScript could at this point create additional elements, it can remove elements that are already on the page, it can change them, it can change their content, but the browser has to wait until the JavaScript is finished before it can continue to create more elements and do the rest of the page. It also can, even later on, interact at any point in time with a DOM tree. So if I click a button and some JavaScript runs, it can create new elements, it can remove existing elements, it can change elements, move them around in the tree. It has full flexibility on the page. It can also respond to events such as clicks, but also such as failed downloads or API calls, or if your website if the device goes into dark mode or bright mode. It has a lot of power, and it basically responds to events that can happen either by the user or coming from the browser or the device that you're on. It also interacts with the network a lot. So JavaScript cannot just work with what is already in the document tree or on the website. It can make calls to other websites, it can make calls to services and grab information and then do something with this information. For instance, again, creating elements or changing elements on the page. But what does that look like when you actually have JavaScript on your page that doesn't exactly do what you want? Well, let's have a look. Let's debug this together. So here we have a website that shows a bunch of news. So we see that there is a few news items already here. And as I scroll, it seems to be loading more items. So I scroll down, I hit the ground of the bottom of the page, and then it loads more. Okay, fantastic. The problem with this seems to be that on this page, while we are scrolling, more content appears. But this additional content doesn't show up in Google search. Now the question is, why is that? A good first port of call is the mobile friendly test or the rich results test or the URL inspection test, depending on if you have access to the URL in Google Search Console or not. I'll use the mobile friendly test. We see the data shows up, so the JavaScript gets executed. That's great. But then when we check here, we see there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 stories on the page. And here we definitely have more than 10 stories. This, I don't even have to count. This is more than 10 stories. So Googlebot is only seeing the first 10 stories. We can also have a look at the loading. What was loaded here? So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories have been loaded. And then here is a call to the top stories JSON, which loads all the different stories to take in. Why is it different in this browser where it works and not working in Googlebot here? So let's debug this. One great way of debugging this is right built into your browser. You don't have to buy any tools for this or anything. Here we see everything that is in the document tree, in the DOM tree that I discussed earlier. We can see that there are many, many list items. If I reload the page, this looks different though. If I reload the page, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's it. And if we look in the source of the page to start with, we actually see none of the new stories. We only see an empty list. This is an empty template and the list is empty entirely. So JavaScript is being used, and we've seen this part. This JavaScript execution initially is definitely part of what is indexed in Google. So we know that this is what the mobile-friendly test sees. So the JavaScript executes fine. But what actually happens here on the network? If we are loading this page again and look at the network, we do see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these stories are being loaded. But when are the other stories loaded? Let's try it. So I go to the bottom. Aha. We see this loads additional stories. But we still don't know why this gets loaded or where this is coming from. So we see that this is going fine. We get a positive response. We do get a bunch of stories here. But there's also this initiator tab. The initiator tab tells us where in the code this is actually being triggered. And we can see there's some anonymous function. This is the function that actually fetches it from the network. Okay, so this is the JavaScript that makes the network request. And this is part of the show page function. Well, that's not really that helpful. Show page does show up here as well. But who calls show page? Well, the first one here is a window.onOverscroll. And we see that here, that whenever, this is an event. Whenever the scroll bar reaches the bottom of the page, it triggers an onOverscroll event or an overscroll event. When that happens, we increment the current page counter and then we load the page for that page count. So when we go down here, we can actually also set what's called a breakpoint. And then when we hit it, the JavaScript execution stops here. And then we're seeing this happening. Now what we know is this doesn't seem to work in Googlebot. Why does it not work in Googlebot? Because the implementation of this is wrong. Infinite scroll is not a problem, but this one was implemented incorrectly. Maybe because developers didn't really care about SEO and didn't know that Googlebot doesn't scroll. Googlebot doesn't scroll, which is why this function will never be called. This implementation has other problems as well. What if I don't scroll, but what if I start with a small window and then extend the window? That isn't a scroll event, so it will also not load additional stories. So the implementation needs fixing, but now you know what to tell your developers. You can tell them, oh, I've noticed this page is actually using scroll events, but Googlebot doesn't scroll. And here's the documentation that shows why that's not working. And maybe there's even documentation that shows how to implement it better. So that's how you can troubleshoot websites using the browser as well as Google tools. The benefit of doing this debugging together is actually you understand what the page does, what the JavaScript on the page does, and you can give more detailed and helpful feedback to your developers because you understand what's happening. If you don't understand, that's perfectly fine. There are many, many real-world websites that are a lot more complicated than this to debug. Maybe just talk to your developers. Maybe ask them, can we debug this together? Because there is a mismatch between what Google sees and what users are seeing. Can we find out where that's coming from and fix it? But understanding what tools you have to do a first investigation is very important so that you can give developers the right feeling for where the problem might come from and help them identify the problem quicker. That's going to be much appreciated. So, But the friction usually is larger and more fundamental. How can we fix the friction between developers and SEOs? Well, there's a few things that I think might help with this. It might help to understand how developers more or less work. Roughly, the work flows like this. Developers become a problem that needs solving. Like, we want to load more stories when the user reaches the end of a page. Not a problem. Let's define a few requirements. It should be fast, it should load 10 more stories, and so on and so forth. So we define a few requirements, and then we start implementing what's happening. So the very first thing before we actually start implementing and writing code is we need to make decisions. So we say, for instance, well, it needs to be when the user hits the bottom of the page, so we can do it with scroll handling. That's a decision that needs to be made. We can say we want to load it like this, we want to load it like that, we want to maybe change the URL, not change the URL. There's a lot of decision making that probably happens depending on the situation that people are trying to implement things. And developers make decisions once every couple of minutes, I would say, maybe even once every couple of seconds. Decisions happen all the time, and many of them are very, very small. But lots of small decisions usually end up being a accumulation of decisions that sometimes lead into a dead end or lead into problems. So the earlier you can influence the decision-making process, the better it is. Once the decisions are made, code is being written. So in this case, the code that we saw was written, and then it's validated that it solves the problem. The code is then being written and implemented, and so that it actually solves the problem. But to check if it solves the problem or not, it is validated, which means the developer now sits down and actually tests what they have implemented against the criteria that was decided. When I scroll down, more stories are being loaded. 10 stories are being loaded. They are loading fast. They are working fine. They're displaying correctly. Done. This task is done. We have succeeded and built the website successfully. Now, you can influence each of these steps, I would say. Optimal is when you are part of the requirements engineering, when you can help your developers define what is important, what is required for a solution to work. In this case, you should say, no, we cannot work with scrolling because Googlebot doesn't actually scroll. So if you would have told them at the requirement stage, you could have potentially prevented the issue to begin with. Also, as developers work on things, they usually think quite often on the decisions they make, and as they go along, these decisions might be revised and revised to actually make different decisions. Be there for them, give them guidance. How can they make the right decision in this case? And if they're like, we are not sure if we should rely on an intersection observer or a scroll handler, you could have said, well, the Google documentation says Googlebot doesn't scroll. So whatever the implementation observer is, it's probably a better choice than the scrolling. You could have avoided problems further down the road. As developers are implementing this, they usually also test if it does what it's supposed to be doing. Help them by showing them the documentation that is available on developers.google.com/search. Also check out if you can help them by telling them what kind of tools to use to make sure that their implementation actually works the way that intended. There's plenty of tools available, such as ngrok local tunnel, to actually get a public URL that you can then plug into tools like the mobile friendly test or the rich results test. Last but not least, as they are testing things and validating their solution works, do the same. Do have a look at if there's anything on the page that is a no-no or a red flag for you, to give them feedback right away and say like, hey, there's a problem with the thing that you think works. It's actually not working quite right for search or for Googlebot or for SEO purposes. And give them, again, then guidance and requirements to keep working. That way you can participate in every part of the cycle. You don't have to sit with them every day. You don't have to be there multiple hours every day. Sometimes it's enough to show them the guidance and to teach them how to get SEO requirements right, and then help them test it. It depends a little bit on your team and on the structure that you're working within and on the organization that you're working in. But I would say try to help your developers and guide them rather than only be jumping in when things are burning to put out the fire. So I think there are 3 simple things you can do. Offer your support often and early. You are experienced, you have the knowledge that they might not have, and that's okay. That's fine. They are developers, they have other things to do. You are an SEO, you have other things to do as well. But if you can help them and establish a connection with them where they feel comfortable asking you for guidance and help, as well as offering that to them more frequently than like once a project or once every month, it helps to see issues before they actually manifest in code, which makes them cheaper and easier to fix as well. Do hang out. If they are having a stand-up meeting, maybe join, maybe listen in on that. If they do sprint demos or sprint reviews, maybe listen into that one as well. If you can just like have a lunch with them every now and then and ask them about what they're working on and what the challenges are. Or if you saw something on the internet where you're not sure if it has the SEO implications or not, ask them about it. What is a service worker? I don't know. Explain to me. They are happily explaining that one to you, I'm sure. Also, prioritize your input. If you come running with every small detail that isn't perfect and pretend that it's the showstopper number one, eventually that desensitizes your developers. If it is a showstopper, call it out as such. But if it's just a non-optimal meta description or a title tag that needs to be rewritten, that's something that is relatively minor, I would say, for a developer, and it doesn't really stop the show. It's just something that you need to take care of. But be reasonable. Just try to be reasonable. Don't cry wolf when there isn't more than a sheep in front of the development team and you. So do make sure that you are reasonable in requesting attention from your development team and the product owner. If you want to learn more, we have a bunch of resources for you available. There is the JavaScript SEO Basics Guide. That is our guide with pretty much everything that you need to know to understand JavaScript SEO in Google search. There are videos. The video series is currently 8 videos in season 1, but we will be filming a season 2 as well, and there will be more videos coming. We have a mailing list where you can discuss JavaScript site-specific problems and get guidance and help from others in the community as well as Googlers. And we also have a bunch of documentation under developers.google.com/search, both for SEOs as well as developers. And last but not least, we do have regular webmaster office hours where you can ask your questions on YouTube, and we'll try to answer them there as well, both for regular sites and for JavaScript. We do publish a lot of different videos throughout, like we have technical content, we have non-technical content. So definitely subscribe and check out our YouTube channel as well. And you can find me on Twitter at Geekonaut with the 3 instead of EE for geek. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful and interesting, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A session.